Great.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
David, thanks for coming to Chattanooga. This is not your first trip, by the way.
No, it is not. Well, no, we have a son who went to school here for a little bit, and it's a beautiful city, and it just keeps getting prettier.
Yeah, well,
like
today
this
is
rain,
not as
though.
pretty.
Yeah,
rain,
exactly.
Rain,
Yeah,
we didn't
right,
call for that.
right,
Usually
right.
the fall is almost a drought it's weird. Chattanooga's weather almost ends up in a monsoon starting in usually late December, January. This year, the rain came a little earlier than expected.
Right. Rain, I've heard of that. I'm from Texas, and so, yeah, we've had quite a drought out there. Yeah.
So one of the reasons I wanted you to come spend time with our audience is your podcast really focuses on the personalities and the human element that drives business. For those that haven't maybe tuned into it, give us a little bit of background.
Well, just a little bit of background. I have to tell you, I was back in 2004. I've been working on a program called Marketplace. I don't know if you've ever heard of Marketplace, but I was a host of Marketplace. And back then, I was also doing some academic work. And I had to come up with a thesis. And my thesis at that time was that podcasts would not survive. So that tells you how much I know. And then I get a call about 2017, late 2017, and it's from one of my old colleagues. And she says, yeah, we're starting a podcast. And I'm thinking, okay. And she says, and the whole idea, the elevator pitch, if you will, is Nike versus Adidas, Blockbuster versus Netflix, that kind of thing. And I get it right like that. But I kind of thought that they were going to just have me do one episode. And they called me back the next week. Great, now we're going to do this. Now we're going to do that. And before long, I mean, we were just talking backstage. We've now have 400 episodes, about 100 different series that we've done so far. These are, battles. And it's been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. It truly has. And I hear from folks on LinkedIn all the time. That's about the only social media I do is LinkedIn. And I hear from people from around the world who are listening. We're now translated into several different languages. On purpose, I'm one of those people, I don't like to listen to myself, right? And I don't like to, follow the comments or any of that kind of stuff because I just consider it generally a downer. I'll ask the producer what I need to work on. And we've had a couple of our series turned into movies. Like we did a series on WeWork, and so I got to walk the red carpet for the first time. And I was meeting the head of MGM Pictures, and he said. I said, wow, it's a real honor to get to meet you. And he said, no, it's a real honor to get to meet you. 5 million listeners a month. I'm thinking, what? We're at 5 million listeners a month? That's crazy, And so I've been surprised perpetually by how much impact the program has had. But that's really a tribute to our producers and our staff and our researchers. It's all those people behind the scenes that you really never get to hear from. They're the ones that do all the heavy lifting. And I think, in a way, that dovetails nicely with what you're doing with FreightWaves. Because what happens in the freight logistics industry, shipping industries, it's the backbone of this country. And I don't have to tell you guys that. But a lot of Americans just don't realize it. And, you've talked about the information that we're going to be hearing a lot about over the next several days. And I think one thing that has been missing when we think about logistics is the story, that through line, that thing that connects mom and dad, that makes kids dream about being involved in this industry. What is that, right? And if you don't think this is critical, just look at the labor shortage right now. Look at the driver shortage, It's hugely important. What is the story? What's that elevator pitch, as I was saying a little bit earlier, And I think what's happening with FreightWaves, with F3, this is an opportunity, especially as we talk about coming out of the great freight recession, to redefine how this industry is understood, its visibility in the larger public conversation. And so I'm excited to hear about, what happens here, because this could be the start of something truly great.
So David, one of the things I absolutely sort of relate to is this constant battle of business. The reason that I think your podcast appeals to me as a founder, it often feels like we're at battle.
Yeah.
One of the ongoing battles or debates is the driver shortage. So I want to pull on this thread for a second, because you talked on a pretty big nerve in the industry. Is the truck drivers feel like there is no driver shortage, and so the industry association says that there is a driver shortage, and so it's this constant rub of, and I think what it actually is a bigger story, which is the labor movement, the people that are doing the hard work, because let's admit that most people in this room don't have it as challenging as somebody that's on the road.
Right.
There's this rub with the sort of rank and file truck drivers, warehouse workers, you could even argue that, the union members that are at the ports, versus what they see as management or the system that's out to get them. And I think that's been one of the primary drivers of so much conversation in our industry, is this idea that the rank and file have been underappreciated or forgotten about.
Right.
And they feel like when the word driver shortage is used, they feel like they're treated as a commodity, as if that's how the industry views them. And I think that's why one of the reasons it's incredibly polarized.
It's interesting. I don't know how many, I'm sure a lot of you here in this room followed what happened with the shipping unions, the threat of a strike there. And of course, this sort of riveted the news cycle for all of about a day or two, right? And yet we understand what that could have meant if that had happened, especially before an election, if you had had this dock workers strike. And one of the notes that was struck during that conversation in the news media was how if you had this strike and it happened before the elections, what that might do to the elections, but also right before holiday season, what that would mean. And there were people that I knew, there were people I'm sure you knew, who were thinking about, gee, we got to go shopping right now because we're going to be in trouble.
Yeah.
Now, that was a powerful thread. That was really powerful. And one of the things that I remember one of the dock workers saying, of course, I'm from Texas, I'm not far from Houston, so, you don't have to go too far to find someone who's directly involved in the industry. And yet, most folks, even in Houston, where shipping is such a big thing, don't really fully appreciate what it is that industry does. They just don't really life goes on. And yet, it hit home. In the same way, by the way, that when we were hearing about supply chain issues during COVID, it was that kind of thing. Well, we keep hearing about the logistics industry in those moments of crisis. And to be honest, I'm not sure that it helped a whole lot when you had the head of the union come out and say, if they want a war, we'll give them hell. It's one of those kind of things. Not a good look.
Well, if you wanted somebody out of central casting,
Yeah.
mafia-esque, I'm going to take down the whole system.
Yeah, you're right.
I want my piece, I think is what I think was the term that he used, the head of ILA. It's interesting because we've been talking about the potential strike for 6 months, and frankly, for labor issues are constantly there. But America didn't wake up into that reality. Consumers did not realize that this was an issue until after it was an issue. It was like a couple days before, and 2 days after the strike began, it was resolved, or at least put on hold, we'll say, and people have forgotten about it. We've moved on. It is interesting. You think about the sort of tension that exists in this industry with labor and management, if you will. And it's, we've had multiple labor issues this past couple of years. We've had the UPS rank and file Teamsters were threatened to strike. They had a new contract. They were able to resolve that. Got an amazing, it was a period of time when the UPS driver looked like it was the destination job, because they were being paid, I think, $170,000 a year.
Right.
You had the railroad strike, or the threatened strike. You had multiple port strikes. You had this one. it feels like the labor issue is, if there is a tension in our industry, if there is a battle in our industry, it is labor versus the man, versus the system. And that's, I think, where that's going to continue to be an opportunity and a challenge in our industry.
But it doesn't have to be, and that's the thing. I mean, you know, I was talking with, I have a lot of us have cousins that we look up to, you know, we've looked up to over the years, and one of my cousins has been in the logistics industry for a long time. And I don't think I'd ever talked with him about what exactly it is that he did. And knowing this was coming up, I gave him a call. And I said, listen, tell me about the logistics industry, because he's been involved in shipping, and, you know, he's been a trucking professional. He's done it all. And Matt, if you're watching online, howdy, and thanks so much. But something that Matt told me was that, you know, if you think about the issues that the trucking industry has dealt with in a large sort of meta way, you know, you're talking about regulations, you're talking about compliance, you're talking about labor, you're talking about labor. And this is going back to the 1960s, you know, with the old line, you know, companies and all that. A lot of these companies no longer exist. And yet still we're talking about these labor and management issues. And I can't help but think that what we're hearing right now from labor is we are underappreciated. It's this thing that you were just talking about. We are underappreciated. How do we leverage, how does the industry leverage, I don't want to say we, how does the industry leverage this moment coming out of the great freight recession to amplify those voices of the people who do the heavy lifting? How do you do that? It doesn't cost a lot, but is there a way to seize upon this idea of celebrating and amplifying what it is? And by the way, if you can do that, you can actually help write a really positive story about the industry that will have people at dinner parties and such saying, tell me more about what it is that you do. I got to understand that. That's what you need in the conversation, you know?
It's interesting, running a media business, we look at the stories that people care about.
Right.
And the reality is, if it bleeds, it leads. I'm just, like,
Yeah,
we look at the
sure.
top stories of traffic, our top 10 stories. We do this every year. We go back and look at the top stories. They're all bankruptcies this past year. Like, that is the stuff, unfortunately, that...
It's linked to bad news.
It's linked to bad news, because I think that's the way that like, we write a real positive story.
Right.
No one really reads, you know, tends to read those things. I always say that in logistics is often like we're a utility in many ways. Like, you think about when your power goes out. You've been in Texas, you've experienced this a time
Sure.
or two. Power goes out, you don't think about your utility company until it happens.
Exactly.
And I think that's the way the logistics industry is often thought about, is that people do not care. It works so well because of all of the people in the room, but also people that are driving the trucks.
You know what people care? They care about when they hear a story about robots delivering your packages or drones, right? I mean, that kind of stuff gets play in the New York Times.
Absolutely.
Last mile. So right now, again, thinking about coming out, thinking about the future of logistics, we know that diversification of of offerings really is going to be central to those who are going to succeed in this new post recession environment. Mm-hmm. All right, so how do you tell a story about the people involved when you're sort of working against this narrative of robots and drones? And I do believe that a lot of players in this industry are going to be thinking about things like last mile. And those are the things that really touch all of us, literally at our front porch. So how do you leverage the people there? How do you put the people in that story in a way that resonates with the reporters and the editors who are going to be putting that on the front page? And it's important, and I think this is crucial, what FreightWaves is doing by focusing on the people who are involved in the industry. But by and large, you've got to reach elites who are the sort of the gatekeepers of the national conversation. How much in the elections did you guys hear about logistics and trucking? I don't think I heard about it very much at all as an outsider.
It was rarely talked about, if at
Yeah.
all. In fact, but this isn't just this election. I think Joe Biden said something a couple of years ago, is that you couldn't even, what is a supply chain? He went on this rambling
Right.
diatribe,
Right.
which is typical of Joe Biden,
Right.
about what is a supply chain. And this was when he was, he's more coherent than he is today. The reality is that I think nobody really understands what this thing is until it impacts them.
Right.
I want to unpack something, because I think you spend a lot of time on your show talking about the human element of.
Oh, yeah.
And it's one of the things that again, relating as a founder, and the worst thing that ever happened to me, by the way, was when my enemy, the guy that I woke up he was a CEO of a rival company. He got fired. He was the CEO of this company. And I woke up for years building this business. He had pissed me off years ago, and had told me that I couldn't build a business and compete against him. And every single day since that moment, it would have been 2018, 2019, for years, for 3 or 4 years, I woke up every single morning ready to kick his ass. Like, when I didn't want to go and work harder or do the work, I woke up thinking about that guy, because that's what motivated me. And then he gets fired from the company that he was at.
Yeah, right.
And I missed him. Like, even though he was my enemy, I wanted somebody to wake up to
Yeah.
want to go fight. And I think one of the things that I have found just so fascinating about the stories that you tell are these personalities. And so, whether it's Netflix and Blockbuster, I think the whole conversation that's happened around just Netflix's founding and being challenged by, or Blockbuster being challenged by Netflix, or Adidas and Nike.
Right.
I think those stories are just so fascinating.
Well, it's interesting. We don't really, unless you do the research and unless you do the digging, you don't know about, how did Adidas become this thing? Why is it we talk about Adidas and Nike as opposed to so many other players in the industry? And when you look back at it, and we were having a conversation about this not that long ago, we tend to think of businesses as sort of institutions, in a way, that are depersonalized. But at the end of the day, business is about the individuals, is about the people. If you look at CNBC, and they do the numbers, they'll give you the numbers, but it's the individuals, the players, that dynamic between. And you talk about your competitor. You in a way yearned for that kind of rivalry, right?
Nothing unites a team. Nothing unites a small startup like having a common enemy. And I hear this. There's founders in this room, and they talk about their enemies, and they want to take them down. And I think that's so important in business, to have some enemy, because it forces you, it's a forcing function for the team. It's a forcing function for the executives to focus on doing something to go after them.
For sure. I was wanting to look up something here that I think sort of this speaks to, and if I can find it real fast. When we started Business Wars, we got some pushback from some people who said, I don't like the militaristic tone of business wars, right? And, it's just a framing thing. It's just a way that we can sort of identify what it is that we do, this versus that. It wasn't really about militarism or zero-sum game, everyone's got to die on the battlefield or anything like that. But something that really struck me was that the Army has this, it's a kind of, we have military folks in the audience, people who've been in the military here. Thank you for your service. One of the things that the Army has is it has a warrior ethos. And let me see if I can find this warrior ethos here. But they teach it in the officers' training course. How to be a great warrior. And I'm going to find this here real fast. I thought I might have it pulled up. Here it is. The warrior ethos. This came after Vietnam, by the way. Y'all all know the story of Vietnam, and it was a very humiliating chapter in American history. And they wanted to make sure that that didn't happen again. And so they really examined hard what it was, where the failure was. And they came up with a warrior ethos that they try still to teach leaders. Number one, I will always place the mission first. Number two, I will never accept defeat. Number three, I will never quit. And number four, I will never leave a fallen comrade. And the theory was, after Vietnam, if we had had this ethos, we wouldn't have lost. That the scene from top to bottom would have been different. The messaging to the public would have been different. But they just didn't have that kind of focus. How many people in this room have started their own business? Look at that. Now, I'm going to give you this ethos one more time and see how this resonates with you. I will always place the mission first. I see you nodding your head. Your mission is to succeed, right? I will always place the mission first. I will never accept defeat. You cannot win in any business. And this is something that we see time and again in business wars. You cannot win without personalizing that, without owning these ideas. I will never quit. Imagine waking up one morning and saying, it is over. It's your Vietnam. So as a founder of a business or as someone who's involved in a startup, you have to have that ethos, if not the warrior ethos, something that in a way you become, even if you don't say it aloud, you become the personification. This has to succeed because it is me. I talk about a work-life balance. It'll wreak hell on that.
I don't think founders get that.
Yeah. But I think to your point about the human side of this, it is really human. It is so human. And if you are committed in the way that that warrior ethos sort of speaks to, I think you need to have, it speaks to other things sort of that flow from that. You need to have partnerships and relationships with people perhaps you'll meet at F3. But you need to have those partnerships, people who can support you in this effort, and they become part of your community. Even your rivals, they become part of your story. What is your story? At the end of the day, who are you? What is your company? And I think that with events like this is an opportunity to build on that story. This is an opportunity to meet that next person who can help and be your friend that you can call and talk about whatever it is that you're facing, or be that next challenger who, like you say, you kind of need to stimulate you, to get you to thinking about your own business. So business wars as a kind of framing, maybe it's more than that. Maybe what we're talking about here is success. How do we define that? And I would say even with, as we're talking about coming out of this great freight recession, which is history making unto itself, what is the story for logistics? What's the end game here? What is it that we want to do?
Well, I think it's interesting because our industry was, and Dan, speaking of warriors who maybe have lost the first battle, Dan Lewis, co-founder of Convoy, certainly the most infamous company at one point, was a disruptor.
Right.
Had a dream team cap table, had everything on their side, raised a lot of money, and couldn't get to the finish line. Their business didn't survive. We're going to hear from Dan here after you, actually. But it is interesting because they were viewed as an interloper. And what I think united that team was the idea that they were on a mission. They had a mission. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately for them, they couldn't finish it. But they also, the system of logistics, repulsed it. Like, in many ways, because they were the resistance, they were the interlopers viewed by the industry, is that the industry in many ways pushed against that. And I think coming out of this, or in the last couple of years, is venture capital discovered logistics, 2015. A lot of those companies are not around that went out and raised all this capital. And I think that's the story, is the market reset has forced some level of discipline among companies that just didn't exist for the last couple of years.
That's right.
We've been able to defy gravity in some ways because businesses didn't have to be profitable. If they could tell an interesting story, they could raise all sorts of money, and basically their fuel was the capital they could raise, not the customer support they were receiving.
Right. Well, I mean, and in a way, the story became a centerpiece because a lot of it was about VC and about investing and that sort of thing. But I do want to get back to this issue of the human stuff. Do you remember, anybody had watched Jeopardy on television? Right? Sure. Okay, so there was this thing that I believe it was a guy named Jennings who went up against a computer named Watson. Does anyone here know what Watson was? I mean, where did they get the name Watson? Interesting thing. We found this on Business Wars. Well, Watson was the last name of the founder of IBM. Now, you could just write that off. But as you dug deeper into this story, you found an incredible, in a way, template for what a lot of business owners ultimately face. And this gets to this human dynamic. Thomas Watson founded IBM, International Business Machines, back in the early part of the 20th century. And talk about the warrior ethos, man. He put his heart and soul into building IBM. And IBM at the time basically made tabulation machines. And they sold a lot of them. This was their bread and butter. They basically were, accounting and that kind of thing. And it was machines. It was manual equipment, mechanical. This is pre-electronic age, of course. Well, his son, Thomas Watson Jr., was working in IBM with his dad. The war comes, and of course, IBM is about to grow, and there's this new player on the scene, Remington Rand and the Univac. Of course, byproduct of World War II was the fact that you had these supercomputers that were starting to be built. The whole concept of computing was starting to be understood. But Thomas Sr., having spent decades building this very successful company, there really wasn't much of a rival. And he was always dogged by antitrust suits and such. He hated that. Well, how are they going to shift gears from a very successful business model to this new age? The truth of the matter is, Thomas Sr. didn't see it. He didn't see it. Thomas Jr., on the other hand, knew that the world was changing. And he and his dad would have knockdown, drag-out fights, ugly fights so bad that Thomas Jr. would leave his dad's office and go to another office and would be sobbing in the sofa, I mean, it was really that bad. And several times, even though Thomas Jr. was really such an important part of IBM, IBM's success, his dad, the fights with his dad were just so intolerable. about ready to leave. And so at one point, IBM is facing a kind of crossroads. There are these new companies that are going all electronic. And his dad just doesn't see it. His dad doesn't get it. And Thomas Jr. knows that if we don't shift to electronics, we are dead in the water. We're goners. And he tries to tell his dad this, and he won't accept it. Well, there's another antitrust suit. IBM was always getting hit with antitrust suits. And Thomas Sr. says, I need you to go and fight this. I don't want to, I can't do it anymore. I'm too sort of emotionally invested in IBM's success. And Thomas Jr. is saying, Dad, we've got to shift. We've got to get out of the tabulation business. And they end up in another fight. And Thomas is again ready to quit. And so Thomas goes to talk to the attorneys, try to get some kind of settlement with the Justice Department. And he's just had this fight with his dad. And his dad gets a message sent over to Thomas Jr. And it's just 6 short phrases stacked on top of each other like a list. It's just a memo that's handed to Thomas Jr. while he's talking to those attorneys. And the memo says, 100% confidence, appreciation, admiration, love, Dad. And Thomas's eyes fill up with tears. Because in this moment, he realizes that what he was really looking for in a way was that connection to his dad. And that somehow his dad reaching out, that had made that connection. And now the fights were over. IBM now belonged to Thomas Jr. He knew that in this moment. Now he could take the company into the new era of computing. Now imagine if that moment had not happened. Imagine if his dad had not realized how crucial Thomas Jr. was to the success. Imagine if Thomas Sr. had had his way and continued to do the tablature machines while electronic computing continued to grow up all around him. It's easy to imagine that we would not be talking about IBM desktop computing. Microsoft might not exist. Think of all the ripple effects there. This is a human dynamic that we don't really fully understand or talk about. And man, everything. I could talk about Nike and Adidas. I could tell you about Southwest Airlines, going up against some of the big carriers. And it's all about that human dynamic. And if we try at the end of Business Wars not to give you a lesson, not to say, okay, here's what to extract from this story. But to me, something that is common, is frequent in these stories, is we can't overlook that human dynamic. That we've got to understand that, in a way, our rival is our friend. That every confrontation can be seized upon as a kind of opportunity, and an opportunity to tap into that commonality. It could be that moment that makes you the next IBM. That person could be the key to it all. And how do we recognize those things? That takes running a business to a whole new level. It's no longer about, just looking at the data. It's about thinking where we can go and what we want to do and the kind of impact that we want to have. And I think this is a priceless moment for the logistics business, for the industry as a whole, because now you have the opportunity. And those businesses that are agile, that make these new connections, they will be the winners in this new environment.
I was asked going into the freight recession by a large company, a very large established company what to expect. And a lot of their staff was new. And what to expect in the downturn, what they could expect. And my conversation was with, are you familiar with the Lindy effect?
No,
So the Lindy effect is a concept that for the longer something has been around, non-organic humans and animals die, but the longer something's been around, the more likely it is to be around. So if something's been around, a book has been around for 50 years, it's more likely to survive 50 years. So the longer something's been around, and the reason is that things get tested.
Right.
And I think one of the things that has turned out to be true, and it's certainly something that I sort of understood early on, but I think has certainly proved out to be true, is that the established companies had been through multiple cycles. Companies like J.B. Hunt had been around for 60. I don't know, Shelley could tell us how long they've been around.
Generation.
For a long time.
Yeah.
And had gone through multiple down cycles and had seen multiple recessions where a lot of the new companies hadn't. They didn't know what to expect.
Right.
But the larger companies, or companies that had been seasoned, even if they're not large, if they're small, but had been through multiple cycles, knew that we would come out of this, that we will too survive even the worst downturn. And I think that is the difference between where we were at before the Great Recession, is that even when there had been periodic downturns, those companies had not been tested. The staff and the resources had not been tested. It's those companies that had been through that, the people that had been from this industry that had seen that actually end up surviving. I want to talk a little bit about one of my favorite stories that you did, which is KFC. And by the way, KFC, I don't love their chicken. I'm a Chick-fil-A guy myself.
Yeah, right.
But one of the reasons that story resonated so well was the personality of the Colonel.
Yeah.
And as you guys were telling the story about this, this old man, an angry man about being taken away, what was about that story, I think the idea that this guy had built something, had burst it, defied all odds, had become a sort of a personality and a celebrity in his own right, but then ended up effectively trying to destroy it at the end.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story. For those who don't know, Colonel Harlan Sanders of Kentucky he wasn't a colonel. It was
all made
part
up,
of the
right?
shtick, right? Exactly, and he had done all kinds of crazy and sort of half-cocked things. But the restaurant that he founded as sort of an adjunct to a motel had really made him successful. So it kind of came out of the blue for him. But he achieved a lot of success. And when the KFC brand was purchased, in a way, it took away the one thing that really had made him famous.
He was old. He was like in his 60s.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Right? Yeah. He's a much older man. He had done everything from door-to-door selling to, I think he sort of styled himself as an attorney for a while, even though he wasn't legally trained. So he had done a bit of everything. But here late in life, he had this wild success, And so when KFC's purchased, he gets that, relatively speaking, it was a small amount of money compared to what KFC would ultimately become, But that wasn't what upset him so much. It was that, in a way, he was now distant from that company, that he couldn't be a part of. He would taste the chicken and couldn't stand the way it tasted. And here's the guy on the bucket.
Had they changed the recipe, or is it just it wasn't his?
It wasn't. Number one, he wasn't involved, and they did tweak the recipe a bit to make it so that you could do mass production and all that kind of stuff. But the truth is, he just couldn't stand it, and I think more than anything else, it wasn't the taste that he couldn't stand. It was the taste in his mouth, that he was no longer at the head of this operation, and in a way, he became both one of the greatest assets of the company as part of the brand, but also one of the greatest liabilities, because you never knew what the hell he would do next. He would show up to advertise, to do tape commercials, and you can see these on YouTube, and they were interesting, to say the least. I don't know, YouTube Colonel Sanders doing commercials, and you'll see what I'm talking about. But again, this kind of gets at that human element that we've been talking quite a lot about, and yeah, it looked like he was going to be bringing down KFC, the very brand that he started. Ultimately, that wasn't.
There's another Papa John. Have you guys done the
We've
Papa
done
John's?
Papa John's, absolutely.
And same story, right?
Yeah.
I think after he got fired, he ate, 30 pizzas in 30 days or something?
Yeah, right.
And
right.
said the pizza was horrible?
Yeah, exactly.
Same kind of.
Exactly. By the way, something interesting happened in the pizza wars. Do we have folks that eat pizza here? Pizza Hut fans. Pizza Hut fans. Yep.
Yeah.
Domino's fans. Okay. The interesting thing, for years and years and years prior to COVID, Domino's always ran number 2 to Pizza Hut. For years. And then COVID hits, and Domino's now faces a PR crisis because online, so many people having nothing better to do, they're hammering Domino's. Of course, they're eating a lot of Domino's, but they're basically tweeting out, Domino's sucks, and it becomes a real big deal online. And this is at a time when Domino's, they need to get as much business as they can. They're struggling like a lot of businesses were, talking about the food delivery business during a time of COVID. Now, they're at a crossroads here. They could do what some businesses do and try to squash, or I should say quash, this rising social media bubble that Domino's sucks. Or they can embrace it. You know what they did? They embraced it.
Domino's embraced that.
Domino's embraced it. Domino's said, yeah, we know our pizza sucks. And they did it online. And they said, tell us, why does our pizza suck? And they did this, and people started saying, your crust is terrible, it's bland, it all tastes like it's processed, and blah, 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 blah. And they said, okay, mark our words. We're going to take what you said here, and we're going to make a better pizza. Okay, so a lot of people thought, whatever, right? I don't know if you remember this, but about 6 months to a year pass, and Domino's is back, and they say, listen, we listened to what you said. We've got a pizza, and it's great. Try it, tell us what you think, and do it publicly. And in fact, Domino's, for the first time in its history, hit number 1. Now, what was going on there? They were engaging their audience, their customers, in an interesting, innovative way. They were also owning it. They knew that they had a problem, and they'd had moderate success compared to Pizza Hut, but they were owning it, and they were making their customers part of the fix. They were making their customers part of Domino's success. So when you ordered a Domino's pizza and you've been complaining about it online, So in 2021, Domino's overtakes Pizza Hut as the number 1 pizza chain in the world. And Domino's had been fighting for years to do this, as you can imagine. But it was embracing that opportunity and recognizing that the criticism was an opportunity in the first place.
David, sort of wrapping up here in a second. What are the sort of you've done 100 different stories.
Series, yeah.
Everything from Taylor Swift to Scooter Braun to Domino's.
Right.
Is there a comment, beyond the fact these are personalities, is there something about the stories that you do that drive these business successes? Is there anything common that you see among the founders of the teams that really define the ones that are successful versus the ones that fail?
Yeah, and it does come back in large part to that warrior ethos. It's the companies that succeed are those companies with strong leaders that cannot fail.
They just never give up.
They do not give up. And when that thought comes into your mind that this is, I'm going to give this up, maybe it is time. Unless you can find that place in yourself, I think that we see that all across the board. If you're ready to give up, Most companies fail because they lack that will to succeed.
They've thrown in the towel. I think it goes back to what we talked about, is that the business war element, I think, actually matters to a founder.
For sure.
Is getting up every morning and wanting to kick so-and-so.
Absolutely.
Like, that to me is what, and it drives a team. I mean, when someone throws shade at Dooner, or it happens, Dooner, or me, or the team, or the data, whatever, that unites the team.
But you know, the best leaders are those who convince people on their team, and even more so, convince their customers to invest themselves in the success. Think of it. What T-shirts do you have in your closet that are corporate because you love it so much? You know, Apple T-shirts, right? I mean, you think Tesla, that's another one. Think of those kinds of companies that succeed. And in a way, they've succeeded because their story, their success is wrapped up in our own identities, our own sense of who we are. And so great business leaders, Southwest is another great example. People are passionate about Southwest. They might not wear the T-shirt, but they're going to buy a Southwest ticket before they even look anywhere else. You know?
I watched a survey by someone who has a large audience about favorite airlines. Mm-hmm. American, this was 2 days ago. Out of all the votes, American got 0. It was like nobody chose. It was the 4 airlines. It was United, Delta, Southwest, and American.
And I was going to say Delta. Look at what Delta does. Look at what Delta does.
Oh, it's a fantastic experience.
Yeah, you bet, you bet. And it's not just the experience, it's an understanding and an appreciation of the fact that if you can get your team excited, the next step is getting the customer excited about your brand. And those they're indomitable.
And Southwest, you know, embrace the we're the rebels. We're defiant. We're going after the government. We're going after, we've been screwed. Right. We're on love field, and they owned the whole little brother kind of storyline.
No question. And who doesn't feel that way, right? A lot of it is the underdog.
It's hard to have a lot of empathy for Southwest today because they're so big.
Right.
It's always a lot more fun when they're scrappy and young and
no question. But Southwest still does curate that, right? This is a conscious thing that Southwest does. I mean, their ticker symbol is love, for crying out loud, right? So anyway, but I think one of the things that we like to, and I know we've hit our time limit here, but one of the things that I would encourage you to do, you can find me on LinkedIn, but we get some of the best ideas for business rivalries from listeners. And if you have an idea, say this versus that, Lysol versus Mr. Clean or something like that, we'd love to hear from you. But I think something else that's telling, and it gets back to your earlier question there, Craig, and that is, what do these businesses have in common and that kind of thing? We can't do the stories that may be very interesting stories about brands that people don't know about.
Yeah, and logistics has plenty of those.
Right, exactly. So I would leave you with this, too, that as you think about the future, who are we and how do we talk about ourselves to the public at large? Not in a sheepish way, but tell me that great story. Just tell me that great story. It doesn't have to be the backbone of your business operation, but I'm sure that over the course of your work, you have had incredible challenges and you've overcome them. That's the kernel of a great story. Write your story. Build it up. Talk to people about it. Get out there. I would love to tell your story on Business Wars. I really would. And I think this is just an incredible moment of massive opportunity for logistics.
Well, David, thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Craig. Very nice.
Please check out the podcast. It's one of my favorites. We're going to invite Dan Lewis from